Before I start this story, it's important for me to clarify that the paranormal here in America isn't seen the same as it is in Mexico, from where my father is from, and from who I heard this story. Here in America, at least from my personal experience, this is seen as nothing more than a cool and sometimes taboo subject to be into, and sometimes people consider it to be sort of a hobby. But in Mexico, on the other hand, it's seen from a much different point of view. This is part of our culture. The same stories that our great-grandparents heard are the same ones that are passed down to us. The stories of duendes, la llorona, nahuales, brujas, and even the devil himself. We're told at such a young age to treat these things with respect and to never take them lightly. To us, it's much more than just witnessing an old chair move on a blurry security camera, or maybe hearing footsteps in an empty room. It's part of our culture. So here's my story. My father is not the type of man to seek attention. He's a humble, honest, hard-working man, and as a result, I believe what he tells me. Since he could remember, he had the misfortune of being more sensitive to the paranormal than most people. What I mean by this is that all throughout his life, he has found himself face to face with most of the stories that we've been warned about. Even now, as a grown man, our entire family has grown accustomed to experiencing more than our fair share. It's almost as if this sort of stuff follows not only him around, but all of us, too. So this story takes place in Mexico, when he was maybe around 8 or 9. He was with his grandfather, who at the time worked as a watchman at one of his friend's stores. This specific store also functioned as a warehouse, similar to stores like Costco or Sam's Club, but on a much smaller scale. For those who are wondering, una bodega. It was around 11 o'clock when they arrived, well past sunset and into the night. My great-grandfather and his friend had struck a deal, and whenever he was on his shift, he could help himself to anything he wanted to eat, as long as he kept the list in order to make sure it wasn't marked down as stolen inventory. As they were getting ready for the night, my dad was told that he could choose anything he wanted to eat. My dad was excited to hear this, as it wasn't often that he was given the opportunity to choose anything from the store that wasn't a necessity without having to worry about having enough to pay for it. He wanted to make sure he made the most of this opportunity and decided to go around the store looking for what he wanted the most. He finally made up his mind and settled on a bottle of chocolate milk. Now, for those who are wondering, a bottle of chocolate milk is something valuable, especially depending on what part of Mexico you're in, compared to chocolate milk or milk overall over here in USA. So he started to make his way around the store and eventually found himself wandering the halls in search of the fridge aisle. After figuring out it was in the very back of the store, he rushed towards the low buzzing hum of the dozens of refrigerators. All he remembers was, and I'll say this in his words, an indescribable feeling of not only pure terror and true fear, but also an endless sense of despair. As he turned the corner, he was face to face with a very tall, thin man. My father tells me this man had to have been at least 2 meters tall. His initial reaction was to try and run away from him, but he couldn't. It was more than being just paralyzed with fear. He felt an endless empty pit inside him, as well as around him. He doesn't remember the face of that man, and he doesn't know how much time passed. He had lost his sense of where he was, and at the time, could not for the life of him tell anything except for the fact that it was him and the man in front of him. He does remember, however, that this man was very well groomed and seemed very well kept. Despite not remembering his face, he does recall that he was staring straight at him. He doesn't remember what happened after. He only remembers coming to his senses on the floor in his grandfather's arms, being questioned about what happened. His face was full of tears. All he could manage to choke out was that the man was there, over and over. His grandfather's first thought was that someone had broken in, and he rushed my father back to the front of the store, where the only lockable room was located, the owner's office. He told my father to wait inside the office, and that no matter what, to not open the door for anyone. He would be back as soon as he checked the store to make sure it was safe. But the memory of the man was still all too fresh in my father's mind, and he decided that he would man up and be brave by running into the man again with his grandfather by his side, rather than remain alone inside the store again. Despite his grandfather believing it wasn't safe, he could see the terror in my father's eyes and complied with my father's wish. After checking through each aisle and deciding that the store was safe, they both headed back to the office where my dad explained everything. For the most part, it seemed to be an isolated incident, as my great-grandfather later that morning told the owner what happened, and he claimed it was the first he had heard of anything of that type of stuff happening inside the store. It is worth noting though, that the store was torn down not 2 months later after this incident, and the owner seemed to give no more of an explanation other than that he was losing money. Despite my dad not daring to outright say what he thinks he saw that night, it's more than apparent to me that based on his description of both the man and the feelings that overcame him, I think it's safe to assume that the man he saw was none other than the devil himself. Before I begin the story, I would like to describe what certain parts of Mexico are like. I'm not talking about Cancun, vacation beach destinations that people be taking to Mexico. I'm talking about deep in the heart of Mexico, in the ranchos and the farms, where there's still no electricity, where there's no bathroom, no fresh water, where you have to walk outside at night in a pitch black field to go to the backwoods to use the restroom. I'm talking about everybody around you is a farmer, and those type of places of Mexico, which is pretty common actually. You might just not hear about it too much. So with this being said, I would like to tell a story of my mom when she used to do her nursing practice when she was in school with a native community in a remote place in Mexico. She said that the internado, internship, where she stayed with the sick people, was across a bridge over a river, and on the other side lived the doctors. So there were times in the middle of the night when she had to carry a sick child to the doctors' houses where they lived. She said crossing that bridge at night was super scary because you could hear La Llorona crying out while you were crossing the bridge. Many of you who love paranormal stuff may have already heard of the word Nahual here in Mexico, and I would guess that also on some other countries in Latin America we call that way people who can shapeshift into animals. Well, here's my story. It was a cold night, I remember, because it was really weird for it to get cold on that side of the country. This was in my parents' house, in a small pueblo, or small town, and back in the day, it was one of the last houses outside of town. Not so many neighbors, but a lot of trees and nature around. The house has a long backyard where we used to have sheep. At one side, a small water stream and trees to the other side. The sheep then started to bleat very loud, something we could call screams. My father then went to give a check on a window in the back side of the house. I still recall his face when he came back quickly, and in a low, urgent voice, he told my mom, "Ve agarra a tu padre y a tus hermanos y diles que vengan ya ahorita. Go ask your father and brothers to come here immediately." They were 4 brothers, my grandfather and my father. When everyone was there, a few minutes later, my father started to tell us what he saw. In the barn, we had 10 sheep. At the moment my father gave a look, all of them were together in just one corner. At the center, there was some kind of big animal. My father described it as a bear, which makes totally no sense, but he said it was big, hairy, and it seemed to be eating one sheep there. This one sheep was screaming really bad. Then, my grandfather told my mom to keep us inside of the house and to keep me in there also with her. If you go outside now, you may catch a bad air. So he made some kind of prayer holding his machete. So his prayer, I remember he said the names of my uncles and also my father's. He then went outside. That's when my grandfather started to yell at the darkness, telling things like, "Vete de aquí, no tienes nada que ver aquí. Deja esta casa. Go away, you have nothing to do here. Leave this house." My father told me that he saw how this thing was in a pose, eating the sheep, which was laying on the ground, still screaming by the way. And when my grandfather yelled at it, this thing seemed to stop and raise its head up towards my family. This thing was only staring at them. Not a single noise, and also no red or shining eyes. Only the shadow looked like it was looking at them. So my father decided to do something at last. He took a big rock, he picked it up from the ground and threw it at this thing. Maybe not the best thing to do in this situation, but I guess this thing was not that strong. Or maybe because it was 6 of us and we all had machetes. But when the rock hit it, this being turned its back and ran away to the forest, running on all 4 legs like an animal would. They then approached the sheep, and my grandpa said how the sheep was on the ground, but it was still alive, but it was completely unskinned. It was horrifying, at least. My grandfather then sacrificed it to stop the suffering. After that night, a family friend told us a story about someone new in town that apparently was a Nahual. He told us he spoke to that man and he told him to leave the town. Indeed, we never happened to live something similar after that. The story of La Planchada, the ghost, is a female nurse. Some stories say she was in love with a doctor who ended up leading her to take her own life. And in others, she is simply a vengeful spirit who doesn't approve younger nurses. And in other stories, she is simply a vengeful spirit who kills patients attempting to ease their pain. Yet one story that everyone is familiar with is the one of her at Hospital Juarez in the early 1930s, where she fell in love with a doctor who was secretly engaged to another woman. She was unaware of the doctor's engagement and began having an affair with a man. A few months later, he told her he was going out of town on a business conference, but he was actually going on his honeymoon with his new wife. While he was gone, a coworker found the woman waiting for her lost love, and the coworker revealed the doctor's secret. The nurse fell into a deep depression, which led her to contracting some sort of disease. This thing eventually killed her, and she is now said to return to the room where she died. Whatever the origin is, the ghost is associated with hospitals, where it can be seen walking the halls at night and checking on patients. This spirit is often described as floating or walking, but always silent, and in some accounts, it even glows. Sometimes it's said that she appears as a normal nurse, a full human manifestation, and other times, it is said that she looks evil with the face of a horrendous creature. And a small detail that always sticks out is the uniform that she wears is usually out of date. Despite the possible horrific appearance of this ghost, it oftentimes heals patients it visits in the night, curing them of disease or healing them, and then moving them to other rooms to recover. The patients who see her describe a nurse who appeared in the room and somehow made them feel better. Hospital Juarez, being one of the possible origins of the spirit, is known for appearances of La Planchada. It is said that the ghost returns to the room where she died and heals whoever is inside. So be careful next time you or someone you know is in the hospital and you all have a pretty nurse that comes inside a room to help you. She also told me that the hospital, where she was a full nurse, was haunted by La Planchada. She said some of their sick people would report how a really nice, well-dressed nurse came in and helped them in the middle of the night. She said they would describe her as wearing an old-time uniform that hadn't been used in decades by nurses. But the thing that stood out was that they would always comment on how well kept, ironed the nurse's uniform was. Now here's the scary part. Sometimes, when they were at the nurse's station in the ICU, they would know when someone was going to code because they could feel as if someone had walked by the nurse's station and into the room of a sick person, but no one was there. They would then get an alert that someone was coding. The nurses used to say that it was la muerte, or death, that would come and try to get the patients. Another story she told me was that when she wasn't practicing nursing yet, she was studying nursing under the monjas, under the nuns, and she said one of the dormitories was haunted. The two dormitories were divided by a hallway, and one day, all the girls were staying in the one that wasn't haunted because they were scared. They decided to roll a coin to the other dorm, and they said that the coin rolled through the hallway and into the other dark, empty room. A few seconds after, they heard the coin stop rolling and drop. The coin was rolled back to them. My dad told me a long time ago about a time when he was a teenager in Mexico, and it was late, and he was walking home after hanging out with his friends. My dad grew up in a rancho, and it was real dark, and the town that he's from is old. Anyways, there was no one out on the road, and he was walking, and he heard a sound, so he looked around at this abandoned house. The house was falling apart, and the windows were nothing but dark openings. He said he saw the back of a man sitting on the top of a roof with his back towards him. As my dad walked past the house, he looked back to see the man still on the roof, and my dad said that the man's legs were so long they touched the ground. I actually think my dad saw Slender Man long before anyone knew what that was. My family doesn't have a rancho, or a ranch. However, we live near a mountain where there are 3 crucifixes, and each year, in Semana Santa, they replace them, which takes about 6 days. While they are gone, it is said that everybody in the community and around there says that the witches go out to hunt children. One year, they heard chains being dragged on the roof at nighttime. My father told me about a time in the 70s when he was driving to his hometown in San Luis Potosí with my mom asleep in the back and her dad in the passenger seat. He said it was late at night and it was raining. The road they were on was empty and long and had lots of turns and curves, and the visibility was bad. He said they both spotted a man standing on the side of the road in the pouring rain trying to catch a ride. My dad didn't stop and kept driving, and my abuelito, grandfather, commented saying poor guy standing out in the rain. They didn't think much of it. However, my dad said that a few minutes later, after passing another curve, they saw the same man, again, standing on the side of the road. It was the same guy. They both freaked out and my grandfather said, "Es el diablo, it's the devil," and to keep driving. When I went to Mexico with my dad in the mid-80s, they lived in a rancho, and my dad told me to go to bed once because after midnight, some of the animals that have been cursed by witches start to talk, and they will come around looking for anyone who will talk with them. So if you live in a rancho, in a farm, or own livestock or animals of any kind, be careful if you hear them talking to you tonight. My mother lived in the countryside and told us of something that happened when she was a kid. She was asleep and heard a weird clicking noise, como una pluma, like the clicking of a pen. She looked outside and said there was a weird thing outside making the noise. It looked like a humanoid, grayish thing, just standing outside their house, looking in. My mom then closed the curtains and started blessing the house, and she said that she never saw the thing again. I want to say this was a skinwalker walking through the neighborhood, whistling, trying to see who would whistle or talk back.